My thesis presentation is on the films of Nikita Mikhalkov and the way he uses a constructed past to create a Russian national identity and portray the future of that Russian identity. So. I'm not sure if this is working. I'm gonna try it. Sorry. Oh, thanks. Okay. So to start with my questions or my puzzle, the why in Mikhalkov's films and why he's been portraying the Russian national identity in a certain way has been the most difficult piece for me so far. Many of the sources I explored claim that he's just simply nationalistic and that he wants to restore Russia's greatness. But in my research, I felt that there must be a lot more to it than that. As Russia came out of the 90s with so much chaos and a loss of status on the world stage, I was very curious of why people really identified and loved with and loved these films. And why exactly would he want to make Russia so unique is another question that a lot of these sources explore. But again, I felt that there's something more personal that he does with his films. And while it's trying to restore Russia's image, there's also a nostalgia for a constructed past. You can feel a sense of loss and longing by watching these films, and there's something about them that people somehow who have lived through what he has identify with them in some way. And also in his films, there's a large focus on the cultural aspects of Russianness. His films incorporate a Chekhovian style of bathhouses, Russian nature, forests, trains, food, celebration, music. We have scenes of czars and the Orthodox Church. And to me, it was almost like he was patching together a quilt of these different facets of Russian identity in his films. And then one quote that I just kind of wanted to share from one of my readings was from Ivor Newman, which says, "The Russian state spent the 18th century copying contemporary European models, the 19th century representing a European socialist model which most of the rest of Europe never chose to implement." And so I thought that was just interesting to consider while analyzing the films as well. It's also, I think, important to incorporate Mikhalkov's personal history and background and understanding what he lived through in terms of understanding Russian national identity through his films. And I think that adds a kind of psychological level to the analysis. Just to give some facts, he was born on October 21st in 1945 in Moscow to a family belonging to the Soviet intelligentsia. His father, Sergei Vladimirovich, is a poet and playwright who wrote the text of the Soviet national anthem, which he later revised when the tune was brought back as the national anthem of the Russian Federation in 2000. So that fact right there was key to me and kind of a red flag. His father clearly had a huge hand in creating the Russian national identity, and while I didn't deconstruct the anthem in my thesis, I still think it's interesting that all that happened within the same family. And also, I mean, his relatives are all very artistic. His mother was the daughter of a famous painter, and in the Soviet system, his family changed the stress on their name to hide their aristocratic background. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, he's shown excessive pride in the genealogy of his family, which he added the stress back onto his name in recent years and produced a family tree that connects his family to Pushkin, Tolstoy, Gogol, and Catherine the Great. So clearly he's saying he is a product of this Russian national identity. And also he has a brother, Andrei, who's a filmmaker as well, but went the Hollywood route, so not as much related. In terms of the literature that I used, Svetlana Boyem's Future of Nostalgia book was really key in helping me understand the kind of nostalgia that was portrayed in his films. It's not exactly what you first think of people just remembering parts of their past, but there was an idea that she highlighted of returning to your origins and constructing an imagined past which fills in these gaps of the collective memory. So I think that was really key in understanding what he does in his films, because he's not only portraying history, but it's also kind of these gaps in history that people don't exactly remember, but there's something familiar about them. It was also useful to look at critiques of the film and reviews, newspaper and journal articles that tracked what his activities in Russia, political and otherwise, and also his interviews and blogs were really helpful as well to just see what exactly he says in his own words. The films I included for analysis are Burnt by the Sun, Barber of Siberia, 12, and Sunstroke. Why did I choose these films? Burnt by the Sun and Barber of Siberia are both films from the 90s, while 12 and Sunstroke represent his more recent cinematography. So I tried to represent different stages in his film career, the 90s versus the current film productions. And I think through that the viewer can witness the evolution of his films and observe this solidifying sense of Russian identity which is promoted. But I mean, there is some overlap, as Sunstroke and Burnt by the Sun and Barber of Siberia all are kind of timepieces, where 12 really represents more present day issues and kind of guides the viewer into how to imagine the future of Russia and what should be done about current issues. And I've also tried to keep in mind major political or historical changes happening in Russia during the time each film was released as well. So I wanted to show a quick film clip, but it didn't work on the projector, so we're going to just watch it on my computer. This is from Barber of Siberia. And I don't know if you guys can hear that. A part that I'm just going to fast forward to. Sorry. So just quickly, this is a scene where the cadets are graduating from the military academy, which is being overseen by Tsar Alexander III, which Mikhalkov himself is playing. And in one of my readings written by Yana Hashimova, she talks about how Mikhalkov portrays a monolithic vision of history and how that idealizes a selective view of the past. And in this scene, in the first scene, I highlighted it because you have this image of the sparrow which is jumping around the cadet's boots, and that kind of helps give an authenticity to the scene by focusing in on one really small part of nature, and kind of allows the audience to feel like they were there or they somehow experienced that, even though it would be crazy to think that because it was so long ago. But it still allows the viewer to feel part of that scene. And also, so it all in turn makes time feel more full by bringing the scene into the detail instead of just having only a panoramic shot of the soldiers. And Hashimova says that manipulates history and offers a nostalgic idealization of this time. And also when Alexander and his son, when he kind of covers his son's mouth, it also kind of gives a human face to the patriarchal power, and it's kind of cemented in by these details which create the illusion of truthfulness. So instead of having this historical figure that maybe people don't really identify with or know him from some kind of textbook, it makes the Tsar seem a lot more human and more identifiable, and like that people can relate to him in a way. And it takes natural history and makes it inseparable from everyday life. Also, it attempts to fuse the patriarchal Tsar's greatness with his love for his son, family, and nation. by transforming illusion into truth. And there's one scene from his Academy Award speech, also was actually from Burnt by the Sun, that is important in that he says, "I want to say the truth, which I don't know, but which I try to find. I want to say the truth, which I don't know, but maybe to say the truth, the cruel truth, that life without love is a lie." And so just to kind of keeping that in mind and what he's emphasizing in his films is I think there is an element of where he's trying to portray truth in some way, at least on his ideals of what this Russian national identity is. And then for my last and only other film clip, I have a clip from Burnt by the Sun. I don't know if anyone can see the subtitles either. So in this clip, it shows Kotov, a Soviet hero from the revolution and the Civil War, and his daughter, who's Mikhalkov's actual daughter in real life, Nadia. And this film takes place in the 1930s. And there's this theme of Icarus flying too close to the sun in the title, which kind of suggests that maybe that these people flew too close to a flawed utopia. And in that clip, what I wanted to highlight was basically just that he talks to his daughter about how she needs to be loyal to her Soviet motherland, and I think you can even just, the Soviet part isn't as important, except as much as the motherland part, and this idea of having loyalty just to Russia in general. One quote that I wanted to share was that the tale of the film represents is largely a tragedy, however, not only for an individual family, but for an entire society. So this film kind of portrays maybe something that didn't necessarily touch the people who are watching it, but that they definitely came from a generation that would have been a very real experience too. When talking about the purges in the 1930s. And also, Kotov is still painted as a very sympathetic character in his idealism, and though his intentions seem to be good, he's still ultimately doomed. And it's interesting that Mikhalkov is able to associate with him in some ways with the Chekhovian lifestyle in the film, as they're living in a dacha and going to the banya, and he also separates Kotov, though, from Europeanism by contrasting him with his in-laws who have an admiration for Europe. And then the last struggle in this film, I think, is how he paints the past and how people can deal with the pain and horror of the purges, but also save elements of what was good to construct a future identity. And also my conclusions are that identity seems to be constructed from culture and how things are remembered. And there's a very specific narrative which is promoted through his films, and they guide the viewer into not only how to think about their past, but how to envision the future. And by solidifying the sense of Russianness as something ultimately unique, from food to music to tradition to history, he creates for the country something that people can identify with, and a sense of culture wholly unrelated to and different from the West and from Europe. And then in terms of what does this mean for the future, in creating Russian culture in his films and his works, he's created a culture that now has a very specific and carefully constructed narrative, which imagines the past in a certain way and gives this imagined past authenticity to allow a strong form of nationalism to emerge in a sense of Russia, how Russia was and how it should be.
Questions, comments, thoughts?
I thought it was fascinating to hear about his genealogical studies and how he's made this incredible family tree. It seemed like an interesting connection to the way he uses his family in his films and himself in his films. So I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit. Is this kind of like a Hitchcockian trick that he's always in his films, or does he just pick and choose? Why?
Yeah, I think it's not an accident that he always puts himself in his films. It definitely seems like he's always this omniscient, godlike character in each of his films. I mean, he's always the Tsar.
And Hitchcock only had these little walk-ons, right? He's not.
He's not the main figure of authority in the films, and so I think there's definitely something to be said about that, because I don't think that's something that's unique to his films. I think that's how he sees himself in his public life as well. I mean, he is a cultural authority in Russia, and I think there's a sense that he, because of his unique lineage as well, is able to have an authoritative view on what is Russian and what is Russia today. And I do think it's interesting that he uses his family in his films too, definitely his daughter. And he did another film called Anna where he just films him interviewing his daughter at different stages of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's pretty interesting too.
It's such a contrast to we saw him in Walking Through Moscow, where he's like everyman.
Yeah.
And he's not omniscient.
Yeah.
He's just kind of like the cool kid. So
Yeah, and even in
Well,
even in 12 too, he kind of is supposed to be everyman because he's one of the jurors, but then in the end he's kind of silently overseeing everything throughout the whole progression of the film, and then you find out in the end that he's actually an officer, and he actually knew everything that happened, and figured out that the kid wasn't guilty before everyone else did from his professional expertise. So yeah. Yeah.
What are some other movies that you were thinking about using? Why didn't you end up using them? Was there any others that you were considering?
Yeah, there were. I was thinking about using Oblomov, which is also about aristocracy, but I just felt like I had to narrow it down at some point, because these 4 films, and I kind of have gone back and forth about even putting Anna in there just a little bit. Yeah, I just felt like these films were so rich and they had so much I could say about them that I kind of just, at some point, he's produced so many films, and he's been in so many films, and at the start of when I was going to do this project, I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to use somewhere he's an actor, somewhere he directed, somewhere he's both, and then it just was so much information. So yeah, thought about it though. Yeah.
I know that in recent, more political side of things, but Putin has been trying to distance himself from the Soviet Union, from Lenin specifically. Could we see these films as a way to kind of return to the imperial past that kind of was brought away by the revolution, or?
Yeah, I definitely think that you could see it that way, because that's what I found so fascinating, is kind of how he deals with the Soviet past, because you can't ignore it, and he doesn't attempt to seem to ignore it in his films, but it's kind of how he reconciles something that it's almost like he's not proud of it, but also he promotes kind of the pre-Soviet Russia in his films, and definitely the imperial time as more close to Russian culture than I think. And I mean, if you look at the Soviet Union, it was so specific, and these values were promoted, and it had a very specific culture that was associated with it. So I think when that collapsed, there's definitely now a struggle to okay, do we identify with that, or do we go back further to what is Russianness? Because now you have a generation that was so defined, went from being so carefully defined, and then not having any definition at all. So there's really a space for him to work it however he wants it.
he writes a play around, Burnt by the Sun was this evocation of the Stalin era and critical but also nostalgic. Sunstroke, the Bolsheviks have suddenly become a lot uglier. The kid who gets the watch from this guy as a child grows up to be the one who sinks the boat and kills this slew of white officers. So he is shifting back. My own sense with Rasulnik, when first saw it, our reaction was, all the American women are whores and all the American men are environmental rapists. So that fits much more with Putin somehow. But that he's playing with the sun in both of them, Burnt by the Sun, Sunstroke, and that it's a harsher view of the Bolsheviks is an interesting thing to try to tease out as we wrap this up. Anyone else?
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, in his later films, to what extent has he tried to promote it outside Russia? Because I guess Burnt by the Sun got the Oscar.
Yeah.
And then in his latest films, like, has there been any publicity for any countries outside Russia to see them, or is it much more just a Russia internally?
I think, well, in terms of Sunstroke, there was definitely floating rumors that it was gonna get some kind of foreign recognition, like any kind of award. There were in different newspapers they published, it would say like, oh, it's maybe gonna be considered for an Oscar, or maybe gonna be considered for this like other international film festival, and not too much came of that. So, I think overall, I mean, I did read a lot of articles produced from Russian sources that promoted, that really were proud of the fact that he's made such an international statement, and I think have thought because of that, it's kind of, one of my sources, I forget where I read it, but it said like he brought people, Russians themselves, back into the cinema after the 90s. So I feel like the international awareness of him really helps his authority figure kind of on these issues, but I don't know that they expected, if there was any kind of real expectation for his more recent films to kind of get the acclaim that Barber of Siberia did, or Burnt by the Sun. So
I was going to say something along the lines of what Dr. Balzer said, that his father had come up with the text for the national anthem. The one that's used now is a slight alteration of the one that he wrote in 1939 for Stalin. So it's a very fine line for him to tread, and seeing how he represents people, I think, I haven't seen Sunstroke, but that would be a really interesting thing because it really affects his own thing.
yeah, there's definitely, I think, an evolution in how he portrays the Soviet Union. Like Dr. Balzer mentioned, he goes from Burnt by the Sun to kind of being a little bit sympathetic toward the Soviet Union, I think, because the main character is such an idealist, and you can kind of forgive him for that, where other members of the regime are, like, obviously more harsh. And then I think Sunstroke completely moves away from that, as, like, all of them are very harsh and vicious. So, I don't know, in recent years, yeah.
I think I told the students in my class, he's also the only person in all my time at Georgetown who's ever totally upstaged me. In 95, 96, when he was being considered, talked about as a possible presidential candidate, we had him come for a dinner, and we showed Burnt by the Sun, and did a Q&A, and the whole Russian immigrant community in the DC area showed up to see him. And when we got to the end of it, I got up to say thank you, and he practically knocked me off the podium to give his own version of what the concluding remarks said. So the ego there was really palpable. Anyone else? We do have, and we've got 5 minutes before we're supposed to start the next one, and in case anybody's coming for that particular talk, I don't want to start too early. Questions, comments?
Yeah, something that you actually said responding to Professor Smith's comment. You mentioned that he is very much seen as a cultural icon or a cultural authority. And I was wondering if that has changed later on in his career when he had, much more patriotic films where he has, you know, a much more, you know, obvious relationship with Putin, and I was wondering what is, you know, his reputation in the intellectual community in Russia today, if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I would say in terms of I think there's a difference between like the general public and the intellectual community, definitely. I mean, from when I just was trying to figure out kind of what he's doing now, I think that you still see him as a cultural figure because you had the Olympics and he carried the torch with the flame, which is just like, you know, keeping the eternal flame alive kind of situation is still very, and that's pretty recent in my opinion. So I feel like that still kind of shows how he's held as this cultural authority. And then also even recently when they had the direct line to Putin, he was able to, you know, throw a question in, which though it wasn't like a very controversial question, still kind of showed him as, I think it was about getting aid for disabled people in a certain region, and it just still showed him as kind of this heroic figure of trying to help these like downtrodden people and appealing to Putin, who he's also kind of friends with, to do so. I would say, yeah.
And I guess you don't want to go too far back in history, but in the 70s, some of his films in the 70s, he did try to push the envelope a little bit. You know, not a wild dissident, but you know, he went up right to the edge of what you could get away with, and maybe a little dancing over it slightly. And I wonder about the psychology of now being mainstream for him, having gone through that dissident period. You know, that one might be harder to tease out, but it's an interesting thing to try to think about as you wrap up that conclusion.
What about his brother? When did his brother go off to Hollywood? How they like brought him?
I was curious about that. It kind of got me off track, but I'm not sure exactly when he went to Hollywood. But I wonder they kind of have like a love-hate competition.
When you could do that
like,
easily.
So, was it Turner and Hooch?
Yes,
Some was a buddy cop movie.
They're like-
No Chekhov in that one.
the opposite. Oh
Very,
no,
very good.
absolutely not.
Okay, anyone else? If not, thank you.
Thank
Good job.